Welcome to the Triple S podcast, where we analyze the stats, the scoreboard, and the statistics. Today we'll recap the biggest college football games of the week and decide the top 10 teams after Week 1, looking ahead to Week 2. The first big game that happened on Saturday was number 3 Georgia going up against number 11 Oregon. Oregon is now head coached by former defensive assistant under Kirby Smart, Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning was the assistant that brought together this Georgia defense that was so fantastic last year. And there was some concerns that without him and without a lot of the players that made that defense so fantastic, Georgia might struggle a little bit in this game. But that was not the case. They absolutely destroyed Oregon, 49-3. I think the biggest takeaway is not on the defensive side, but on the offensive side of the ball. As Stetson Bennett went out today, he had a career-high 368 yards and 2 touchdowns, which, in most people, and me included, thought that Stetson Bennett would hinder Georgia this year, and I think he hindered them last year a little bit with him not being such a dynamic playmaker. But here he showed how dynamic he can be and how effective he can be, and I hope we see this later in the season, because if we do, Georgia's going to be a really good team. And I mean, they already were going to be a really good team, and they already were going to be elite, but now they have a different side of them that's not the running game, that's not defense, but that they can throw the ball more in the air a little bit. They don't have JT Daniels anymore, but Stetson Bennett will definitely provide that in a way he didn't last season. On the other side, Oregon clearly showed their offensive, and Bo Nix, they're just not ready. Bo Nix showed the flashes of his worst moments in Auburn. He had 2 interceptions, 0 touchdowns, and only completed about 16 passes. And if they can't get it together, Oregon might not have a shot in this Pac-12, which is really talented there with Utah and now with USC, UCLA in the mix there in the Pac-12. We'll have to see if they can get it together for Week 2. I'm not sure if they can. I wouldn't be counting on it. We move on now to another Pac-12 team that I just mentioned, Utah. They didn't fare well either this week, as they lost to Florida 29-26 in a really nail-biting game right there at the end, which was decided by a game-sealing interception in the red zone by Amari Burney of Florida. But I think the biggest playmaker today was the one that we all expected would be the biggest playmaker, Anthony Richardson. He had 3 touchdowns on the ground, he had 0 turnovers, and I think his decision-making had improved so much in the offseason. He looks like he knows what he's doing. He's maturing in ways that he hadn't last season. Last season he had a lot of interceptions. He would run the ball too much in situations where he probably should have thrown it. But today I didn't see any of that. I saw he knew when to get out of the pocket, but he also knew when to stay in the pocket and make those good throws. And he had the ability to stay in the pocket because their offensive line was really good. He wasn't really pressured a lot. He did have the chance to move outside the pocket because he is such a mobile quarterback. But the offensive line really helped. They also run block very well, as the Gators ran the ball very well with freshman Trevor Etienne, who's a real bright spot for that team moving forward, as just he's a true freshman. This was his first game. Utah played well, but they didn't do very well in the red zone, especially in these 2 situations near the ends of halves, where Florida was able to first make a big stop on 4th down right at the goal line, and at the end of the game, that game-sealing interception really hurt them right there, obviously, because they were almost making it down. They had made it around 70 yards down the field, and they almost had won that. But they just weren't able to get it done in those big pressure situations in the red zone. However, I don't think Utah played that poorly. They played a really good game. They just weren't able to get it done, but I still have confidence in them. Much more confidence than I have in Oregon when they go back to the Pac-12 this week. I think that they still have a future. I don't know if they're a playoff team anymore, but I definitely think that they can get it back, and they can perform very well this season. But both of these teams in these games, Oregon and Utah, they both really deflate the Pac-12's chances of making any real noise in the postseason. The other really big Pac-12 team, USC, played well, but they were playing Rice, and it shows how far the Pac-12 is behind the SEC in these two games. That the biggest team in the Pac-12 lost to a team that wasn't really supposed to compete in the SEC East even. But the biggest game of the night for sure was a Big Ten matchup versus Notre Dame. Ohio State beat Notre Dame 21-10. It was the game of the night, and it was number 5 Notre Dame versus number 2 Ohio State. And I think the biggest takeaway from this game is how well the Ohio State defense did. Last season, they weren't very good, and that really hurt them because they had a really elite offense, but that really hurt them in games later in the year. But right here, I think they showed how well they can play. This is a really physical Notre Dame team and a really strong Notre Dame team, especially in the trenches. But they only allowed 76 yards on the ground, which really hurt Notre Dame. They only scored 10 points. And which was good because the Ohio State offense didn't wow. They were very good, but they only scored 21 points. But I think that they'll be fine because if you look at the statistics, they weren't lacking in any area. The C.J. Stroud passed it very well. He had around 240 yards. The running game was very complementary to the passing game. They did very well there. And there wasn't really any mistakes or anything. They just didn't really get it going till the second half. And I think it shows how good this Ohio State team is, that they can afford to sort of be off against the number 5 team. I think Notre Dame is really good, and I think they deserve to be in that top 10 spot. But Ohio State is just a better team overall, and that showed today. And I think that that'll really show now that they go in the Big Ten play against teams like Wisconsin and Michigan State and Penn State later in the year. And that even when they're not on, they can still win these games against high-level opponents. And Ohio State should be a top 3, a top 5 team in the AP poll when it comes out Tuesday. But now I'll go over my top 10 teams after this Week 1 game going into Week 2. Number 1 is not Ohio State, but it is Alabama, who beat Utah State 55-0. It was a dominant performance by Bryce Young and that whole team, as expected, and I think that that's why they retain that number 1 spot for me. Number 2 is not Ohio State either, but it's Georgia, who, again, beat Oregon 49-3. Oregon was previously number 11, so it's a big statement win, and that's why I think they'll be moving up. I didn't have them originally at number 2. I had them more at number 3, number 4, but I think that this really was a good performance for them. Number 3 is Ohio State, who beat Notre Dame 21-10. Again, they played really consistently. They didn't play what some people expected them to play, like very offensive-minded and very high scoring. But they played very consistently, and they were able to hold Notre Dame out of the end zone for a while there. And I think that that's a reason why they're in this top 3. They were number 3 in the AP poll last week, and I think that they'll retain that spot. Number 4 is Clemson, who plays today against Georgia Tech. They're expected to win that game, so that's why I have them in the same spot. Number 5 is Texas A&M, who beat Sam Houston 31-0. There was a rain delay that sort of interrupted that game, but they played really well. Their quarterback play was surprisingly well for a team that had a lot of volatility last year. It is only Sam Houston, but I think that it shows that Texas A&M is ready to play. Number 6 is Notre Dame. Despite the loss against Ohio State, I think that they are a really good team, a really solid team, and I expect them to play really well against a couple other of their high-profile competitions, such as BYU and Clemson. And I think they're a really solid team that just got outplayed on Saturday. Number 7 is Michigan, who wiped Colorado State 51-7. They looked really well with Cade McNamara splitting time with J.J. McCarthy, as they're going to do these first 2 weeks. And I think that they showed a really good performance right there against Colorado State. Number 8 is Oklahoma, which beat UTEP 41-7. Again, another good performance. It was a good showing out for Brent Venables and their new quarterback, Dylan Gabriel. I'm excited for them. I think that they'll do pretty good this season. However, they are number 8. I think you still have to temper expectations with them because of that really new staff and new players in there, a lot of new players. Number 9 is a team that I think is very underrated, and that is Michigan State. They beat Western Michigan 35-14. I was surprised when the AP poll had them at number 15. I think that Michigan State is a really good team, really underrated. They're really well coached, real disciplined with Mel Tucker, and they have the pieces there to make a good run. I think that they can challenge Michigan again this year and really do some damage there in the Big Ten. And rounding out the top 10 is Baylor, who absolutely just destroyed Albany 69-10. And Baylor, they aren't expected to do a lot in the Big 12, but they weren't last year, and they almost won the whole thing. They did win the whole thing against Oklahoma State during the championship game. So I don't expect them to be elite this year, but I do think that they'll be hanging around that number 10, number 15 spot, and we'll see, because they play BYU next week, number 25 BYU, in a game that will really show how far they've come this season under second-year head coach Dave Aranda. And that'll be one of the biggest high-profile games next week, which we'll cover later this week on the Triple S podcast. But that's it for us right now. Thank you for listening to Triple S podcast, and I'll be back next week.